This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Baruchim Abba, and welcome everyone to a special edition of All Parsha on Parshas Behar-Bechukosai. We're going to focus on a Ramban on Parshas Behar that is fundamental to our understanding of the giving of the Torah, and very important, and will revolutionize our understanding of the Yom Tov of Shavuos. Because in general, there are two very basic questions we could ask about Shavuos. Shavuos is a commemoration of the giving of the Torah, while in fact the Torah that we have today was not really given on Shavuos. Moshe attempted to give us the Luchos Rishonos on Shavuos, but he broke them. And then he had to go up again, and then ultimately he came down with the Luchos Shniyos on Yom Kippur. So why in the world are we celebrating the giving of the Torah that didn't seem to last, and we don't celebrate the Torah that we seem to still have today, the Luchos Shniyos? Furthermore, the Kabbalas HaTorah of Luchos Rishonos is celebrated quite fundamentally different than the Kabbalas HaTorah of Luchos Shniyos. Shavuos, Chazal say, Hakol Moedim, Tzrichim, Nami Lachem. Everybody agrees it has to be celebrated physically. And Yom Kippur, which is the day that we received the Torah we have today, you can't, ein bayachilo shtia, there's no eating, there's no drinking, there's no physical enjoyment. How do we account for this very polar opposite way of celebrating these respective Kabbalas HaTorah? So I want to share with you a Ramban. The Ramban is in Parshas Behar, Perek Chaf Aleph, Pasuk Aleph and Beis, where at first Ramban quotes Ibn Ezra, who learns that the command about Shemitah here, Bahar Sinai, is not really in the right place. Instead, it's topical. Namely, that this is referring, according to the Ibn Ezra, to the explanation of Shemitah given by the Luchos Rishonos. And the Ramban says, no, this pasuk is actually in chronological order, and I want to take you to Ulefi Daiti Ki Nichtava Kan B'Seder Nachan. In my opinion, Ramban says, our portion is written in the right place, Ki Perush Bahar Sinai, when it says on Mount Sinai, Ba'alois Hashem L'Kabel Luchos Shniyos, this is referring to Moshe's ascent to receive the second set of Luchos. Ubeir Ha'inyan, here's the explanation. Ki B'tchilas Arba'am Yom Rishon Shaluchos Rishonim, the first 40 days of Luchos Rishonim, Kasa Moshe B'Sefer Habris, Moshe wrote on the Book of the Covenant, that's mentioned in Shemais, as Kol Divrei Hashem, all the words of Hashem, as called Mishpatim and Emarim Sham, and all the laws and statutes that were given there. Vayizrek Dam HaBris Ala'am, he threw the blood of the covenant on the people, and he made a covenant with them. Now that's certainly of note, because it does not seem that when it comes to Luchos Shniyos, Moshe had to sprinkle the blood again, and Moshe had to hear the acceptance of the people and their response of Na'aseh v'Nishma. Uchshechatu be'egal, when the Jews sinned with Egel, v'nishtabra luchos, and luchos were broken. Now, here are literally some of the most fundamental words ever penned by the Ramban. Ki'ilu nizbatla habris hahu eitzel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's as if the covenant was annulled by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, if the covenant was annulled, like we asked earlier, why do we celebrate the giving of the Luchos Rishonos? That covenant was annulled. We should celebrate Kabbalas HaTorah of Yom Kippurim. But the answer is, we have to read the words of Ramban carefully. He says it's as if the bris was batel by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but not to Klal Yisrael. And the Ramban elaborates on this principle in Parshas Kisisa, Perek Lamed Daled, Pasuk Chav Zayin, where on the Pasuk Soiv L'cha Es Hadvarim Ha'ileh, Moshe was commanded to write the Sefer HaBris, to read it to the people, and the Ramban wants to know, do they have to receive it? Do they have to accept it? Do they have to respond Na'aseh v'Nishma? So at first Ramban says, yes, they have to respond Na'aseh v'Nishma, because whatever occurred by Luchos Rishonos presumably needed to occur again by Luchos Shniyos, and there's no doubt that Klal Yisrael said Na'aseh v'Nishma, so why doesn't the Torah write it? It already wrote it the first time, so it presumed that you would understand that this would have to transpire again. But then the Ramban says that that is not the pshat that seems definitively correct in his eyes. He says, "V'hanochem be'enai," that let's think about what happened. Who broke the covenant here? God broke the covenant? God didn't break the covenant. The Jews broke the covenant. What's the halacha and the legal nature of a covenant between two parties where party A breaks the covenant? Now, if party A breaks the covenant, party A is still bound by the covenant, party B is no longer bound by the covenant. So therefore the Ramban says, the Jews were the ones who broke the deal. They're still bound by the Torah. The Torah of Luchos Rishonah still binds Klal Yisrael. It's God who is no longer bound to care and tend to the Jewish people. We blew it. We're still bound. God's not bound. So therefore, it was not necessary for Moshe Rabbeinu to hear from Klal Yisrael, Nasav and Ishma. Klal Yisrael already accepted it, and it's irrelevant what they say to this new deal, because the new deal is not for them. The new deal is out of the good graces of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He wants to bind himself, to make himself again responsible to care for us. That God will no longer renege. And Moshe Rabbeinu was, so to speak, the Unterführer, the go-between, and he wrote the Tanaim. And therefore, Moshe didn't have to sprinkle the blood on us, and he didn't have to wait for our response, and he did not have to make a new deal. In the realm, in terms of relative to the Jewish people, from the perspective of Klal Yisrael is always and was always bound by Luchos Rishonos. Luchos Shniyos is for God only. Because we broke the deal, he's the one who's released. Now we're not released. Interestingly, that's the Ramban writes in Parsha Kisisa Perek Lamed Daled Pasuk Gimel that on the pasuk of the Ish Lo Yala Imach, that no man could go up at all with Moshe Rabbeinu, not even the Zakenim. By Luchos Rishonos, the Zakenim went up, and it says V'gam Ish Al Yeira B'chol Hahar. What about the fact that by Luchos Rishonos Vayamdu B'Sachtis Hahar? No, nobody could go up. The Zakenim cannot go up at all. By Luchos Shniyos, the Jewish people cannot even be B'Sachtis Hahar. By Luchos Rishonos, the cattle grazed opposite the mountain. No, Gam Hatzoin V'Abakar Al Yeru El Mul Haharahu. This time around, nobody could be anywhere near the mountain. The Zakenim can't go up. The Jews can't be at the foot of the mountain. The cattle can't be opposite the mountain. Why not? Says Ramban, Ata Hechmer B'Shas Matan Haluchos Elo. This is Ramban in Kisisa. God is being more stringent with the second Luchos more than Ma'amad Rishon. The reason is, says the Ramban, Luchos Rishonos were for all of Israel. So if it's all of Israel, they all need to be there. So Moshe went up, Zakenim went up a little bit, the Klal Yisrael went to the foot of the mountain, even the cattle could come near. But Luchos Shniyos, it's not for the Jewish people, it's only for God. Why is it for God? Why did God accede to bind himself again? It was only in the merit and the prayer of Moshe. It was only in the prayer of Moshe. Says Ramban, Godol yiyah hakavod hanigla al har ha'achar min harisha. And God's glory that was revealed on Har Sinai the second time around was greater than the first time around. Because the Jews were not legal parties in this deal. This was God deciding to bind himself even though he didn't have to. Reb Simcha Zisel, Broida, in his Sefer Samderach, explains that is why Moshe Rabbeinu was only zoicha to the karnei hoid, to the rays of light, after the giving of the second luchos, not by the first luchos, because the first luchos, that occasion was not as spiritually energizing as luchos shniyos. The nuclear energy of Har Sinai was of a much greater magnitude by luchos shniyos than by luchos rishonos. Hence, Moshe was zoicha to the karnei hoid, specifically by luchos shniyos. This would explain, perhaps, Reb Simcha Zisel Broida explains, this does explain why we celebrate the giving of the Luchos Rishonos, because in terms of our perspective, we are bound by the first deal. Luchos Shniyos is only from God's point of view, because since we broke the deal, God is released, he bound himself through Luchos Shniyos. So our Kabbalah Satar is Luchos Rishonos, we celebrate Shavuos. God's being bound to us is through the Luchos Shniyos. Now we understand, Shavuos has to be celebrated physically, because Shavuos is the day that the Torah was given to us from our vantage point. But God is not bound by Shavuos. God is bound by Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur is a celebration from God's vantage point. From God's vantage point, the only way to celebrate is Yom She'im B'Yachila Ve'im B'Shtiyah. There's no other way to do it. So Shavuos is the Yom Tov of Klal Yisrael, but Inan Nami Lachem, we have to celebrate physically. Yom Kippur, according to Ramban, is God binding himself, committing himself not to annul his covenant with us. That was on Yom Kippur. Hence, we could explain that's why it's celebrated purely spiritually. Now, the Ramban continues that this explains the immortal words of the Ramban that Ki'ilu nisbatla habrisahi itzel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's as if the covenant was annulled by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Uchshenisratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'mash b'luchos shniyos. When Hashem acceded to Moshe Rabbeinu by the second luchos, tzivahu b'bris chadash, he commanded him in a new covenant. Shenemar hinei anochi kaireis bris v'hechser sham hamitzvos hachamuros. There, God repeated the stringent mitzvahs shenemru b'seder ve'elah mishpatim that were taught in the order of Parshas Mishpatim, Beris HaRishayna, in the first covenant. Va'amar, and Hashem said, K'soiv l'chasad v'arma'ela, write these matters, Ki al pi v'arma'ela, karati et chabris v'es Yisrael. Now the Ramban explains the role of the Teichacha. You ever realize? By Luchos Rishaynos, there was no Teichacha. Of course not, says the Ramban. Because Luchos Rishaynos, both parties were keeping their end of the deal. So, everyone trusted each other. There was no need for a Teichacha. Now that Klal Yisrael reneged, that released HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now God is not responsible for us anymore. He's going to commit himself through Luchos Shniyos, provided that he ups the ante, and he says, look, this time around, you better keep these mitzvahs, because not only are there a lav, or a kares associated with the prohibitions of the Torah, now there is an entire toichacha and set of rebuke for not observing the Torah. So the toichacha was sort of the insurance policy to allow Hashem to feel comfortable about recommitting himself to the Jewish people. Says Ramban, V'rodza HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rebbeinu Shem wanted lahachmer aleim, to be more stringent with them, b'bris hazos, with this covenant, hashenis, shatia aleihem, that it should be upon them, ba'alois, with oath, uveklaus, and with curses, v'tia karishayna, and it should be binding like the first, Al kol ha-mitzvos ha-rishaynos ve'al kol ha-mishpatim, k'moshe ne'amar b'bris rishayna, es kol divrei Hashem, es kol ha-mishpatim. That is why at the end of the Teichacha, in this week's Parsha, Lefikach, at the end of Behar-Bechukosai, Lefikach Omar, Bekan, at the end of the Teichacha, it says, Eile hachukim v'hamishpatim ha-Torahs. These are the statutes and the laws and the Torah that God gave, Beinoyu ve'in b'nei Yisrael, Behar Sinai. What do you mean, Eile divrei Eile hachukim ha-mishpatim? Eile ha-Teichacha. At the end of the rebuke, it should say, this is the rebuke, not this is the Torah. No, the function of the rebuke, this is so fundamental. Otherwise, what's the Teichacha? God is just hurling at us curses, oaths, for what? The answer is, we reneged. Once we reneged, God is released from being committed to us. He has to agree to make a new covenant, not from our vantage point. We're still bound. From his vantage point. He's only going to do it if he ups the ante and he has confidence that we're going to observe the law. That's the Teichacha. This, says Reb Simcha Zisel Broida in the Sefer Sam Derech, would answer an interesting Tosfos in Shabbos Daf Peches. The Gemara in Shabbos says, Mikan Moida Rabbaloi Raisa, that since God forced us to accept the Torah, we have an opt-out clause, and we could say, hey, why are we really responsible to observe the Torah? You forced us into it. So Tosfos says, but what about the deal and the Kabbalah that Klal Yisrael made at Har Grizim and Har Eival? Wasn't that a willing acceptance of the Torah? So Tosfos says, no, that was also forced. So Reb Simcha Zisel asks, well, why didn't Tosfos ask a different question? What about Luchos Shniyos? Wasn't that a willing acceptance of the Torah? Why didn't Tosfos say that the Jewish people are bound to keep the Torah because of Luchos Shniyos, which presumably we accepted willingly? Says Reb Simcha Zisel, Luchos Shniyos is irrelevant to the Jewish people. Luchos Shniyos was from God's vantage point. The Jewish people were always bound by Luchos Rishonos. And that was forced. And whatever was added to uphold the original acceptance of the Torah will not make it anything less than we were coerced into it at the time of the Luchos Rishonos. So this gives us a very basic and fundamental perspective of the difference between Luchos Rishonos and Luchos Shniyos. Luchos Rishonos is what binds Klal Yisrael. Hence, we celebrate Shavuos. That's our end of the deal, and we celebrate the way we know how to, namely physically. Luchos Shniyos was Hashem in His goodwill agreeing to recommit Himself to the deal, but it's not really relevant to the Jewish people. Therefore, the celebration of Luchos Shniyos are the way Hashem would recognize, namely Ein Bayachila Ushtia. And now we understand the role of the Teichacha. The role of the Teichacha was the higher level of commitment that God required for Him to agree to recommit Himself to the Jewish people in Luchos Shniyos. And this is really all alluded to in one line in the Ramban on Parshas Behar, and that is Uchshachatu be'egal, when the Jews sinned with the egal, the nishtabra ha'luchos, ki'ilu nizbala habris hahi. It's as if the covenant was nullified. Eitzel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the Rebbeinu Shalom, not from the vantage point of the Jewish people. Okay, wishing everyone a wonderful week and a wonderful Shabbos. Behar-Bechukosai, Chazak, v'nis chazek me HaKadosh Baruch Hu, strengthen us, b'limud HaTorah HaKadosha. Have a great week.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.